let's talk about cursor. So far, all the SQL statement that we have learned work on a set of data, the data set, which means there's no particular order. So mathematically speaking, a set does not have a particular order. All the items in the data set does not have a particular order. Set-based algorithm like relational algebra cannot handle processing between rows because there is no order between objects in the set. The only exception we have is a Windows function, which is actually an extension of the original relational algebra. Now, in order to but if you want to go beyond Windows function for further row inter-row operations, you do need to have a certain procedural processing capability. For row-by-row processing, basically, you need some ability to do a procedural processing in the order. So cursor is invented to handle this question, this issue. It will processing one row at a time from a data set. Especially, it can be used to processing one row in the order that you specified. So cursor definition is like vendor specific, just like a store procedure, but the basic logic is the same. So you will define a cursor based on a query. You will define the data set that the cursor will operate on. So when you define cursor, you need to define the data set it will operate on. And this data set usually comes with the order by clause, which specify how the data are ordered, the rows are ordered. Then we'll initialize the cursor just by telling SQL, the DBMS that you will start using from the first row. Then you will loop through the rows to let cursor process each row. Inside the cursor, you will define the SQL statements, which we will be using in order to process the row. And the one thing you can do is you can store previous rows in a variable so that you can handle that in the later phase or together with a current row. This is how cursors are able to handle multiple row processing. Now, cursor in Postgres must be defined inside a transactional block, such as a function. We will see what it means later, but fundamentally that means cursor must be defined in a function, and cursor must contain a series of statements. And when we discuss function, we said you can have multiple logic inside function, including like conditions or looping. Those of you who have a programming background understands that the control function, the control structure of a programming language basically is a conditional branching and the looping, right? And conditional branching can be done using like case or some other statements. And cursor will take off the looping part. Now, how do you define a cursor based on query? This is an example. You can declare a cursor one, a cursor. You can define this name cursor one as a cursor for select star from instructor, but usually we don't do that because that means the cursors, the data set in the data in the cursor is still not ordered. So there's no way of a reasonable processing. Or you can define a cursor with a parameter, still select from, but with a certain where clause utilizing the parameter. Of course, you can do further down like join and group by, and then followed by order by. So these are the ways you can define cursor. You can either define a cursor just straightforward with a select something star, or you can define a cursor with the argument. Once defined, you will open the cursor, and then you will do a loop through. You will do for record var in this cursor, you will loop, and until you end the loop. So this will be for record variable in this cursor with parameter or without if you didn't define arguments, loop through. And here you can have multiple statements, right? You can do multiple select, insert, update. But for us as an example, we are just using the raise notice. And finally, you will close cursor, but most DBMS will automatically close the cursor after transaction block anyway. So let's take a look at an example of cursor. So let me make sure we do have a instructor table. So I just confirmed that we have the instructor table because our cursor will be defined on top of this cursor, this table. So I'm going to create a function and place my cursor inside this function. Well, we have the same familiar create function, returns and the S block. Let me do some further indentation so that it looks better. Okay, so inside this dollar block, we have a declare cursor where the cursor will be select instructor name from. And here I'm actually doing a simplified version of cursor, a rudimentary version, which does not do row-to-row operation. So I didn't define order by, but usually when you do the regular normal cursor, you want to do some some definition between rows, you will have an order by in the cursor. So I'm going to select the instructor name for the certain affiliation. Then inside this cursor, I'm going to go through this for each record in this cursor, which is basically a Jedi affiliated instructors list. I'm going to print out the Jedi instructor's name. Okay, so let me start by defining the function with the cursor in it. Then I'm going to run this cursor example. And here in the message, you can see that because there are 3 instructors, I'm printing out 3 instructors. There are 3 Jedi instructors, I'm printing out 3 lines. Okay. Now, get back to PowerPoint slide. Cursor may look very appealing to students, especially students with a programming background. They do like cursor. But you do need to remember that the SQL infrastructure, the relational algebra, the relational operation, the SQL operation, is defined on set operation. As such, the infrastructure is defined to optimize SQL dataset processing. So the regular SQL operation is much faster than cursor. Most cursor was invented in a time when there were no Windows function and the row level processing is very limited. Now that we have Windows functions, most cursor can be replaced by Windows function now. So when you think you need to use cursor, you want to try to think like a relational DBMS. You want to perform set operation instead of a row level operation, because in the end, if you do a set operation without an order, particular order, if you can do the operation without order, that means you can distribute. You can distribute your calculation, your computation into multiple nodes, into multiple CPU. They can each process without any particular order in mind. The reason cursor is slow is because you have to go through the order one by one. So your processing power is limited by a bottleneck, For this reason, cursor should only be last resort unless you don't have any other option. You shouldn't use cursor.